They came for the light first. I remember that like a photograph burned onto the back of my eyelids, a smear of orange from a street lamp that never quite went out, a halo the size of a coin, and then the slow, patient approach of shadows that did not belong to any living thing. If you want the truth, you should know I wasn't a hero. I was the kind of person who learned the city by its small routines. The coffee cart on 42nd, the subway screech at midnight, the way pigeons owned the plaza outside my building at dawn. Those routines are what kept you sane. When they broke, everything else unraveled. It started with noises that felt wrong for the place. Not the screech of brakes or the muffled laughter from late-shift diners, but a wet, dragging sound like a sack being pulled across pavement. Up close, it smelled of metal and old fruit, a smell that clung to your throat, iron and rot, and something sickly sweet that made my stomach convulse. At first, I thought it was garbage collection gone wrong. Then I started seeing them in the distance. Figures in the fog of the avenue, too many heads bobbing in the same rhythm, mouths slack, eyes like holes filled with cloud. The city that knew my footsteps didn't answer that night. Storefronts were lit but empty. Automatic doors would open to reveal merchandise untouched and aisles quiet as a grave. I learned to listen for small things. A broken bottle's crystalline jangle, the whisper of an elevator, my own shoes on tile. Each small sound proved I was still there, and perversely, that was the most comforting thing. But between those sounds, something else breathed. Low, wet, collective breaths, as if a crowd of animals had taken shelter under every bridge. I saw the big one the second week. It stood half-hidden behind a row of burnt-out stalls, a hulking silhouette against the faint skyline. It was absurdly large, like a man who had swallowed city blocks and had no intention of apologizing. Its shirt clung to a belly that moved with a slow, indifferent hunger. When it turned its head toward me, I felt the air change, not cold exactly, but thickened, as if the night had been kneaded into dough. It didn't run. Nothing did. They wandered, persistent and patient, and when they passed, the world smelled older for having known them. I told myself stories to stay human. Maybe it was a disease, maybe a theater stunt, maybe a nightmare everyone shared. I kept journals at first, quick lists of sightings, times, the sound of a particular footstep, because naming things still felt like a defense. The lists grew longer. The entries stopped. My handwriting trembled on the last page. They learn patterns. They wait where you are loudest. That was the night I stopped sleeping with the lights on and started sleeping with the curtains closed, listening for the wet scrape of something that should not have hands. They learned my routes. Whatever moved through the streets mapped my smallest habits like a cartographer. I took detours, doubled back, changed trains, but the city folded itself to guide me toward them. The dragging sounds became patterns, not random, but rehearsed, rising and falling like a choir with no conductor. At night, the air tasted metallic, and every shadow felt thick enough to scoop into your palm. I found messages where messages should not be. A neighbor's apartment held a TV stuck on a loop. Emergency instructions, static, the same announcement again. I knocked, no answer. Chairs lay overturned, a plate crusted with something dark. On the wall, in a panicked scrawl, "They follow shadows." My handwriting later appeared in the margins of my own notebook, letters I didn't remember forming, as if someone had practiced writing me into a fate. It crept into the building. I woke to soft, collective breaths in the hallway, a patient rustling as if coats moved on invisible hooks. I pressed my back to the door and counted the breaths until sunrise. A postcard lay outside my threshold the next morning. The skyline smiled on the front, the back printed with one sentence: "We wait behind faces." I watched windows. People moved in them like marionettes, slow and predictable. Trying to tell others felt obscene, like reporting that the ocean had stopped breathing. Phones went unanswered. Emergency lines offered calm recordings about conserving resources, and those who spoke sounded rehearsed. In the stairwell, I cornered an older man who smelled of cologne gone sour. He smiled and said, "They take the parts that aren't needed." His smile held no teeth. The real horror was the small betrayals. Reflections lagged behind me by a breath. Mirrors showed a mouth opening when mine did not. I woke with a sour copper taste in my mouth and the memory of a weight at the foot of my bed, like a heavy, lazy thing settling in the dark. Once, I found a smear on my doorknob and the impression of a fingertip pressed into it, too deliberate to be accidental. I stopped running. Walking felt like the only way to see them without becoming the loudest version of myself. They had gathered in the square as if waiting for a guest, rows of mismatched bodies, faces blinking with the slowness of wet photographs. The big one leaned against the wall where comics used to be sold. Its breathing rolled like a tide, thick with the smell of iron and stale bread. When I approached, there was no rage, only a cold, methodical interest. They touched me the way someone flips through an old book, a finger tracing my skin, a palm memorizing the shape of my face. Each touch pulled small pieces of me loose, the scent of morning coffee, a song I used to hum, the faint scar on my wrist. They didn't take anything violently. They collected me, quietly. I tried to scream a name, a plea, something to remind myself I was still real. They answered in sounds that mimicked ordinary life, the clink of a cup, the whisper of keys. When they stepped back, my notebook lay open in my lap. On the last page, in my own handwriting, were the words, "I opened the door. Now they know where my habits live."
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.